Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Well, this is a historic day, and it's not necessarily a good day in the Republic, but it is historic in that the articles of impeachment have been drafted. I'll talk about more of that in just a minute. And that, of course, moves back to number 2 and 3 and 4 slots. Some of the things I was hoping to talk about this hour, which we still will a little bit later this hour, and that is the Inspector General report and the reaction from the Attorney General and John Durham and others doing some investigations. So whether it's William Barr, John Durham, we'll get into their responses to that, which are pretty significant. And one of the articles we have posted on the website, and that was one that we were going to focus a lot of time and attention on. We will a little bit later this hour. I don't know if I'll even have time to get to the other very interesting blockbuster report that has come out from the Washington Post, and that is the argument that the Afghan war was based on a series of lies, and that goes really back to George W. Bush, Barack Obama. You could probably try to list a little bit under the Trump administration, but he was trying to pull out from there in the beginning and actually use some of those concerns as the reason why he's withdrawing troops. And a couple of other issues that we will certainly get to. But I guess first and foremost, we need to talk about the fact that today, House Democrats did announce that they will vote on whether to impeach President Donald Trump on 2 specific charges. And I'll get into more of the details of that in just a minute. But one is the so-called abuse of power based upon that one phone call to Ukraine. And then obstruction of Congress, where some of the wags around Washington, D.C. are today saying, what about the obstruction of Donald Trump by Congress? But that's a different story for a different day. And the articles represent sort of a culmination of the investigation that happened first in the Intelligence Committee, now in the Judicial Committee. And so the House Judiciary Committee plans, first of all, to vote on this. And the statement from the chairman is Gerald Nadler, who basically said that they are charging the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, with committing high crimes and misdemeanors. Nadler said, unlike President Trump, we understand that our duty first and foremost is to protect the Constitution and protect the interests of the American people. And then goes into the inquiry, which has been, in some respects, especially in the House Judiciary, relatively quick and in many cases somewhat meaningless, since a great deal of the time was spent simply hearing from a couple of lawyers, law professors in particular. And I'm going to say more about that in just a minute, because, boy, if you said anything that didn't toe the party line, you're going to run into a lot of trouble, as I will document in just a few minutes. The announcement was made, interestingly enough, at this point. They also had a comment from the House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, saying the evidence of the president's misconduct is overwhelming and uncontested, but they took no questions after the presentation. And, of course, he now will, of course, be voted on first in the committee and then in the House. And the judiciary's ranking member is Representative Doug Collins. He's a Republican from Georgia. He is the ranking minority leader, if you will. And he says he expects the Democrats will pass the articles of impeachment before Christmas, because he said ultimately it's a clock and calendar issue, and every American ought to be scared about this. And this, of course, leads to one of the questions that is worth mentioning, and that is, what is the rush? Why can't you just have this articles of impeachment surfaced, go home to your constituents, see if they have anything that they want to say to you on how to vote, and come back in January and vote? And I think there is a very good reason why this is moving so quickly. We saw yesterday with the release of the Inspector General report, which, despite what you've heard in the mainstream media, was very critical, much more critical than, say, the Washington Post and others would have made it sound like, of the FBI. But you have a second report that is going to come out that is going to be even more damning, if you will, and that is the study by the U.S. Attorney John Durham, not to mention some of the comments yesterday by the Attorney General William Barr. And when that comes out, they're not limited, like the Inspector General's report, to only talk to individuals in the judicial department, because now they can, it's much more wide-ranging. They can even talk to people in different countries, think Germany, France, Ukraine, and a couple of others. And they also can bring indictments. And so there is a sense in which, if indeed you feel that this is going to be negative towards some of the Democratic members in the House, let's get out in front on this issue of impeachment. And we certainly have seen that unfold before our very eyes. Katie Pavlich put it this way. We have, of course, two charges in this particular case. One, the obstruction of Congress. The other, abuse of power. As she points out, Democrats claim the abuse of power stems from President Trump's July 25th phone call with the president of Ukraine, and that involves corruption. I think, again, anybody looking at the transcript can say that's maybe ill-advised, maybe the question, but it is certainly not anything close to the kind of abuse of power that we have seen in the past. But more importantly, the obstruction charge is even more curious, because the argument being made is that the White House blocked witnesses from testifying. First of all, I'm not sure how blocked they were. They just informed those individuals that they do not need to testify, and they did not. And it's worth keeping in mind that both Adam Schiff and Gerald Nadler could have gone to the courts, compel witnesses to actually testify, but simply put that in there in a rush to impeach, because this is not without precedent that any president, and we've seen quite a few, by the way, both Republicans and Democrats, tell some staff members to not actually testify or to ignore a subpoena, whatever it might be. And so that is one of those interesting little footnotes that, if you don't hear being mentioned by the mainstream media, it tells you a great deal about the media bias, because this issue of obstruction is created out of whole cloth and is meaningless, given the fact that we've had many times in the past when various individuals had to be compelled by a court order or a actual binding subpoena to do so, and this was never done, and so it's just used as one more example of why this president needs to be impeached. Now, during the announcement, Gerald Nadler did lay out a timeline. The Judiciary Committee will vote by the end of the week on these charges, then send them to the House for a vote before Christmas, and we're talking about next week, most likely. And then again, if Democrats vote to pass it, then it goes before the United States Senate. Get all sorts of comments, one coming from a Republican, Lee Zedler, who said, with this disgusting impeachment charade, House Democrats are proving themselves guilty of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. So he wanted to turn it around on them. But how about some of the Democrats? One moderate Democrat is Representative Colin Peterson. He was one of the two Democrats, by the way, to vote against formalizing the impeachment procedures. And he actually said, I'm certainly leaning towards voting against the articles of impeachment. I just think it will be too divisive for the country. It doesn't accomplish anything. So there will at least be some Democrats, it looks like, that will vote against the articles of impeachment. So we'll see how that vote goes next week. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's open up the phones, get your comments. If you would like to join us, we are talking about articles of impeachment that will be voted on in the House Judiciary Committee and then voted on in the House of Representatives. Do you agree with this decision to actually bring articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump? What are your thoughts? 1-800-351-1212. I'd love to get some of your thoughts and comments about that, and we'll open up the phones and give you a chance to join our conversation. Before I hear some of your comments, let me give you a few other comments. This one from John Cass, and as you will pick up from his piece that I'm going to read, not necessarily a Trump supporter. Matter of fact, probably just the opposite on a couple of very important issues. He's a columnist for the Chicago Tribune. But he also recognizes that this is probably a bad move for Democrats. He refers to it as the self-destructive Democrats push forward on impeachment. And he points out that with American unemployment numbers at a 50-year low, with people working with money in their pockets, the House Democrats rush forward on their path towards what he calls madness. They insist on impeaching President Donald Trump, though they have no hope of securing a conviction in the Republican-controlled Senate. So he sees this as a fool's errand, tilting at windmills, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so he then asks 2 sets of questions. Are House Democrats principled patriots fighting for the right against tough odds, or are they cynics aided by media cheerleaders? He says, you're the only ones who can answer that, because the only answer that counts is the one the American people, both Democrats and Republicans as well as independents, will give on Election Day, November 2020. Yet even with an election less than a year away, he says Democrats are in a rush to impeach Trump over his wrong-headed phone call to Ukraine. He linked military assistance and asked for an investigation into what happened there during the Obama administration when Joe and Hunter Biden employed Chicago Way-style muscle in Ukraine. First of all, I disagree with his premise, but that's okay. You know, he's a columnist. He's allowed to say that. I don't think he did link military assistance to that investigation, but, you know, he's looking at it through a set of eyes and said, you know, this looks like, since he's writing for the Chicago Trib, something we've seen before in Chicago politics. So he obviously is not a Trump supporter. He thinks the phone call was wrong-headed. I agree with that, by the way. I think there would have been all sorts of other ways to have handled that other than the phone call. But as John Cass points out, Ukraine got the missiles it wanted. Ukraine didn't give Trump the investigation he sought. So end of discussion from his point of view, even though he accepts the premise that I certainly would reject. And then he said when the Bidens were rolling in Ukraine, Joe was the Obama administration's point man there. Son Hunter was making $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian gas company, which was being investigated by a Ukrainian prosecutor. Joe threatened to kill a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee until the prosecutor was fired. Guess what? The prosecutor was fired. Joe Biden bragged about it on video. So, again, the way John Cass looks at it is, who has clean hands, he says? Well, actually, neither Trump nor the Democrats. He says when you deal in Ukraine, it's just like when you deal in Chicago, you won't find any angels. So again, he's not necessarily a Trump supporter by any stretch of the imagination, but he's saying this is a mess, and to make this the reason for why you want to impeach the president makes no sense at all. And so to show that he does believe the president deserves some punishment, he goes on to say, I've said Congress should consider censoring the president, but not impeach him. The Democrats haven't proven he violated the law, and foreign aid, like all politics since the beginning, is all about quid pro quo. So if nothing else, I appreciate a person that's not necessarily a Trump supporter, but still recognizes this is ludicrous. And so he says, without offering any real proof, without bothering to wait for a court battle to compel witnesses from the White House to testify. Remember that point. And again, if you hear anybody talking about impeachment today and talking about obstruction without pointing out that all it would take was a court to step in to compel some of these witnesses, then this obstruction would actually go away. If you don't hear that mentioned, that tells you a lot about the bias. But nevertheless, he says, what is the Democratic rush to impeach about? He says it's political, it's about leverage for fundraising, and it is self-destructive. He goes on for 2 more pages, but I will spare you. But he talks about how some of these individuals are, for example, making comments, Nancy Pelosi invoking the founding fathers in the Federalist Papers and saying that she's trying to fight the madness of our modern day Orange King George, and some great rhetorical flourishes in this. It's a very nice piece to read by John Cass, K-A-S-S. But again, he's not necessarily a Trump supporter, but he's saying this is nuts. You know, you Democrats, you just are using it to raise funds. You're raising it to try to tarnish the image of Donald Trump. And his argument would be Donald Trump's done enough of that on his own. I doubt he's going to vote for the president, but he also thinks it's crazy for the Democrats to head down that road. So that brings us to a piece by Cal Thomas. I'm good friends with Cal Thomas, but I hadn't even thought about reading his piece the other day, but I heard it was mentioned by one of the Trump campaign people, so I thought, I need to go back and read it. Well, first of all, he starts out with Elton John. You know, remember Elton John? Okay, you can feel the love tonight. Well, he says, well, with apologies to Elton John, can you feel the hate tonight? And he gives us some good examples. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked by reporter James Rosen, who, by the way, used to be with Fox, but is not any longer. But anyway, was asked by reporter James Rosen if she hates President Trump. She responded with an "if looks could kill fire" in her eyes and denounced Rosen for his question while claiming she doesn't hate Trump. Really? I mean, come on. Former Vice President Joe Biden the other day had an 83-year-old man in Iowa who asked basically whether Biden's son, how he managed to get a lucrative job with a Ukrainian gas company while lacking any experience in the field. You remember what Joe Biden did? He challenged him to a push-up contest and called him something liar. I won't use the word because FCC has rules about this. And then, if this is not bad enough, let me just show you how crazy the left has become. George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley was on the panel with the three other individuals. He made it very clear that he did not vote for President Donald Trump. He's not a Trump supporter, but he also made it pretty clear that looking at these various ideas being presented by these other law professors for what would be impeachable. Remember some of the things he was asked in a really interesting kind of conversation that unfolded, because it was so interesting to actually find that indeed there was questions being asked about what would or would not be appropriate in terms of an impeachment standard. He nevertheless in each case was able to say, no, if you applied this to previous presidents, they'd have to be impeached too, and we've never really done that before. And so what you have is an interesting set of circumstances in which he was actually saying, look, I'm not a Trump supporter. I don't think he committed impeachable offenses. And so then he's now said, my home and my office were inundated with threatening messages and demands that I be fired from George Washington University. So here's a man who is hardly a Trump supporter, hardly an individual that has ever voted probably for a Republican in his entire life, who nevertheless has actually had to address the kind of hate that a lot of the rest of us have had to address over time, which then leads to Cal Thomas's piece, in which he points out that maybe the reason for this has to do with what we announced on Friday. Cal Thomas, I'll just read how he puts it. Non-farm payrolls surged by 266,000 in November, better than the 187,000 expected by economists. The unemployment rate ticked down to 3.5%, back to the 2019 low and matching the lowest job rate since 1969. The end of the GM strike had a big effect, boosting employment in motor vehicles and parts by 41,000. And average hourly earnings rose by 3.1% from a year ago, slightly above the 3% expected by economists. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average soared 337 points in response. Then he goes on to remind us that African American, Hispanic unemployment are record lows, and then points out that a little bit later in the column, maybe that's what's causing some of this, because that scares, he says, and angers Democrats. Because if they lose significant numbers of black voters, they're toast. He says Democrats have taken the black vote for granted. They've talked a good game, but failed to deliver with jobs and better education opportunities such as school choice. So he says if the hatred seems bad now, and it is, imagine what it would be like should President Trump have the opportunity to name another justice to the Supreme Court. It will make the hatred directed at Brett Kavanaugh seem tame. So his argument is the rush for impeachment is to simply drive the narrative away from all the good economic numbers, the low unemployment, and the unprecedented phenomenon that is actually taking place right before our very eyes. So if you'd like to join us, I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll move on to the Inspector General report, but I thought we'd talk for just a few minutes about the articles of impeachment. We'll be back right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. What about this issue of articles of impeachment? And if you would like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And I'd love to hear your comments about what is now unfolding before our eyes on this historic day. And if you'd like to join us, we'd welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And let me, for just a minute, come back to something I just mentioned in passing, but it's worth focusing on because I also address a little of that next week in a commentary that I've just taped. And that is, we had 4 different law professors that testified earlier in the Judiciary Committee. And one of those who was more of, if you will, the outlier was the professor from George Washington University Law School, Jonathan Turley, an individual, by the way, who many times has really been very critical of the president, did not vote for the president, has been a Hillary Clinton supporter, is not a supporter of the president, but also was very fair even under Barack Obama, to point out that part of the difficulty that Barack Obama had at the time was the so-called Fourth Estate. The bureaucracy wasn't cooperating with him. And so he's also written some pieces, and you can go and type in Jonathan Turley on our website and find some of the commentaries where I favorably quote Jonathan Turley, who points out that there really is kind of a deep state. It was hurting the effectiveness sometimes of Barack Obama, and it has really been hurting the effectiveness of Donald Trump. But nevertheless, here is a man who wrote an op-ed explaining why, indeed, even though I may not like some of the things President Trump has done, these do not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. They're not high crimes and misdemeanors. And yet he has now said, my home and my office were inundated with threatening messages and demands that I be fired from George Washington University. And, of course, he gave some of that testimony, but a lot of it came from Representative Ken Buck, Colorado, Republican, who said, Mr. Turley, given what the other 3 law professors have used as the standard for impeachable offenses, would that apply then to Lyndon Johnson, who directed the CIA to spy on his presidential opponent, which would be Barry Goldwater? Of course, he agreed with that. Would it apply when Franklin Roosevelt directed the IRS to conduct audits on his political enemies? Gives a list of those enemies. Jonathan Turley said, yeah, probably would. Would that apply when President Kennedy directed his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Well, yeah, it's obviously the case. Goes down this long list. Roosevelt signing an executive order interning 120,000 Japanese Americans and so many more. And the point I'm making is this argument that was made by one of the other panelists, which was Michael Gerhardt, that the conduct of Donald Trump was worse than the misconduct of any prior president, is laughable on its face. And yet, simply by challenging some of that, you can see very easily why, once again, you have almost the hysteria, because he's trying to insert some common sense into sort of a mob rule, which is just not working very well. And, of course, one of the things that Cal Thomas said just a minute ago, which relates very much to my commentary yesterday, is that if you think there's hate in the air right now, with, again, apologies to Elton John, just imagine what it would be like if we have another vacancy on the Supreme Court. Which brings me to my commentary yesterday, which, again, I appreciate Dr. Merrill Matthews sitting in his chair and probably didn't have a chance to talk about my commentary. So let me just point out that it's something that has now been proposed by a number of individuals, both left and right, Republican and Democrat, and that is to maybe consider whether or not to have term limits on the Supreme Court. The ones that have been proposed are like 18-year term limits, which would be staggered so that it would be a vacancy. It would come up every 2 years. Because you've had some presidents that have been able to appoint up to 3 Supreme Court justices, and that's been a few cases like that Certainly Ronald Reagan fits into that category, and others. There have been some that have had no opportunity to appoint Supreme Court Justice. Jimmy Carter would be a good example there. And this would make it a much more regular kind of process. Would it dampen down all of the heat of the confirmation battles? Probably not, but it certainly would eliminate this almost health watch right now taking place with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I thought I just might mention that my commentary yesterday was on the subject of possibly implementing term limits for the Supreme Court. It's something that two Supreme Court justices, one appointed by George W. Bush, one appointed by Bill Clinton, have endorsed partially. Republicans and Democrats have endorsed it in various venues, so it's worth a consideration or at least an open discussion and debate. But let's get to what I was thinking we might get to in the first hour, and that is the release of the Inspector General report by Michael Horowitz. He's the Inspector General. We were alerted many weeks ago that he would be releasing his report on December 9th, which was yesterday. So let's talk about that for just a minute. Here's a good illustration, I would think, of bias in the media, because when the report came out, most of the media reports were quick to say that Michael Horowitz and his investigators found no evidence of intentional misconduct or political bias in the FBI's attempt to seek a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign aide, which is Carter Page. Now, first of all, a little bit later, reading from Gary Bauer, said that doesn't even pass the straight face test, because you can look at, for example, the email texts and other texts by Peter Strzok to see that that was the case. There was an announcement we made before this report came out that there was at least one FBI agent that actually had modified some of the material that went to the FISA court. So there is all sorts of evidence almost staring you in the face that there was bias. But okay, Tucker Carlson did this last night, and I thought, that's a good thing. Okay, every once in a while, even in the midst of an argument, I'll say, well, let me concede your point. Let's assume that there's no political bias. Does that make you feel good? That we now know, because there were, I guess they counted 17 more than a dozen, 17 different fundamental, basic, and serious errors in the application, which allowed them to use a device that was implemented under George W. Bush to spy on terrorists, to use that to spy on one of the people working in the Trump campaign. So again, I'll ask you the question, even if there was no bias there at all, let's just assume for a moment there isn't. Does that make you feel good that you can still just have all sorts of fundamental errors, which you've got to say at this point then all were due to the incredible incompetence of the FBI, which I don't believe for a minute, but okay, I'll concede the point. Maybe they just didn't know what they were doing when they filed a FISA report, that then they could spy on an American citizen who did nothing wrong. I mean, seriously, just think that through. Even if you accept the headlines that nothing was done wrong, that certainly is not making me feel any better. But the point I think is now worth mentioning is that when that report came out in the Washington Post and a few other places, then you had something that is completely unprecedented. You have the Attorney General of the United States, who heads up the judiciary, William Barr, post this statement. He says the Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. It is also clear that from its inception, the evidence produced by the investigation was clearly exculpatory. Nevertheless, the investigation and surveillance was pushed forward for the duration of the campaign and deep into President Trump's administration. In the rush to obtain and maintain FISA surveillance of the Trump campaign associates, FBI officials misled the FISA court, omitted critical exculpatory facts from their filings, and suppressed or ignored information negating the reliability of their principal source. The Inspector General found the explanations given for the actions unsatisfactory. Gary Bauer does this for all of us that aren't legal experts. He says, for those of you not versed in legal jargon, it is critical to import that, he says, exculpatory evidence or facts, meaning information that exonerates somebody of guilt. In other words, the Attorney General of the United States just accused the FBI of hiding information that cleared Carter Page and Donald Trump. So again, if that was done by accident, by incompetence, does that make you feel any better? And the kind of headlines we're getting is, oh, there is absolutely no evidence of intentional misconduct. I disagree with that, but even if that's the case, it allowed the government to spy on an American citizen who did no wrong, and we now know did no wrong, and the FBI continued to maintain this even when they had evidence to the contrary. That should not make you sleep well at night. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Legislative prayer is as old as the United States. In fact, offering a prayer before a public meeting should be one of the least questionable topics of our day. That's why some on the Cleveland City Council in Ohio would like to bring the practice back to its meetings. Thankfully, the law supports them if they do. Not only has the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the practice of legislative prayer twice, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit has even said that the lawmakers themselves can lead such invocations. That's partly why we litigated the American Legion versus AHA, where Justice Samuel Alito agreed with our understanding of the First Amendment and noted that religiously expressive practices, such as legislative prayer, that have long been a part of our nation's history and heritage, bear, quote, a strong presumption of constitutionality. Well, just a few weeks later, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Fields versus Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives noted that the presumption of constitutionality that they spoke of in the American Legion case also extends to legislative prayers. As we recently explained in a letter we sent to the council members, the Cleveland City Council is on solid legal ground to restart its practice of legislative prayers, extending that level of freedom to all Americans, whether they are private citizens or elected officials, reflects the very best of the American brand of freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, Lynn, we now get to the first article. That shows you how a lot of things have moved down the order of priority. But the first article is by Al Parada, which I think does a good job also of summarizing some of the things we've just mentioned. It is entitled Barr Durham Rain on Media Parade, Celebrating FISA Report Conclusions, because it reminds us once again that sometimes the first story out or the headlines don't tell the story at all. And he points out that the Department of Justice Inspector General put out the long-awaited report on the FISA abuses by the Obama FBI, but Attorney General William Barr and U.S. Attorney John Durham, remember that name in just a minute, aren't buying what Michael Horowitz's summary is selling. Of course, he gives you a link then, which we have on our website. So you can, if you want to, read the 476-page Inspector General report. No, I'm not going to read it either, and you probably won't, but it's there if you'd like it. And again, Michael Horowitz and his team of investigators found, as I mentioned just a minute ago, 17 failures or significant inaccuracies by those who secured these 4 FISA warrants against a Trump campaign official. Of course, that's Carter Page. And interestingly enough, they say, well, we did not find documentary testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced the decisions. And the media has been running with the no political bias headline like kitties with a candy cane from grandma. But the candy cane quickly proved bitter. And that's the part I want to get to. Because then you have, and this is just unprecedented. You know, some people have been around Washington a long time. Britt Hume is one of those, and I heard him last night say, I just don't know of anything like this, where you have the Department of Justice puts out a report, and within 2 hours, 3 hours, I don't know exactly the exact time, but a few hours, you have the Attorney General, who heads up the Department of Justice, disagreeing with the report. What? How did that happen? And so you have the Attorney General, William Barr, says that the Inspector General's findings show a clear abuse of the FISA process rather than no political bias. Then, again, going back to the Attorney General, William Barr, he says, quote, the Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken, unquote. And he didn't stop there because then, as Al Perota points out, that it's clear from its inception the evidence produced by the investigation was consistently exculpatory. Remember what we talked about, what that word means? It means it would have shown that this individual who is going to be surveilled, spied on is a better word, Carter Page, shouldn't have been spied upon. Nevertheless, the investigation and surveillance was pushed forward for the duration of the campaign and deep into President Trump's administration in a rush to obtain and maintain FISA surveillance of various individuals. Now, recognize it's not just one individual. Anybody that Carter Page communicates with, that could be the president, that could be the vice president, can be the campaign manager. Just think of all the people that could be. Then you have access to those as well. So you only need one to get to many. And so then, if that's not enough, since we're getting close on time, you already had some incredibly harsh and critical statements being made by the Attorney General. What about now the U.S. Attorney? And his name, as we pointed out just a minute ago, is John Durham, who's been doing an investigation which I think really is going to have a real impact on some of these individuals, both in the Justice Department, maybe some members of Congress, which I think explains this rush to judgment so quickly on the impeachment process. But here, let me just quote from Al Perota, because he says if, again, William Barr's take was not enough, U.S. Attorney John Durham, he says, has given James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, and the rest of the DOJ FBI cabal real reason to worry. Durham is conducting a broader criminal investigation into the origins of the Russian probe. Unlike Horowitz, Durham's investigation is not limited to developing information within the Department of Justice. Recognize that essentially all the Inspector General can do, interestingly enough, is interview the people that are still with the Department of Justice. Most of those people are gone. Most of the people that are involved with it are gone. And he also is not limited to just the Department of Justice. He can interview people in what? Other countries. Oh, that would be like France, Germany, Ukraine, a couple of others. And so he goes on to say he's developing information for persons and entities in the U.S. and abroad. And here's what he's found. Quote, and this comes from, again, John Durham. Based on the evidence collected to date, and while our investigation is ongoing, last month we advised the Inspector General that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to prediction and how the FBI case was opened. If you want to find a little bit more, Molly Hemingway writes for The Federalist, and she's got kind of this long thread of things, but I'll just read those real quickly. First of all, the report has found numerous and serious factual errors and omissions. The report has found a failure across 3 investigative teams to advise the NSD, that would be the Department of Justice National Security Division, of significant information that undercut certain allegations in the FISA applications. In other words, they left stuff out that would have cleared the target of the spine. Then the report also found a lack of satisfactory explanation for these failures. Also, the report found that there was a continuous failure to reassess the factual assertions supporting probable cause in the FISA applications as the investigation proceeded, and information was obtained raising significant questions about what's called the Steele dossier. And the Steele dossier was essential in getting the FISA warrant, because the argument has been in the past, oh, no, even though that was a bought and paid for piece of basically research done pretty much for the Clinton campaign, it was not the only reason for the FISA warrant. Now, it looks like it may have been. Also, though, the Federalists pointed out that the Inspector General report seems to now document that John Brennan lied to Congress when he said the Steele dossier was not included in the 2016 Intelligence Community Assessment used to brief President Obama and President-elect Trump. By the way, that's one of the things that Roger Stone got convicted of, you might know, lying to Congress. Will Brennan be similarly charged? And, of course, then finally, that Carter Page was spied upon based upon significant omissions and inaccurate information in the initial and renewal FISA applications. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, this article is on our website. It has a link to the Inspector General's report. Also has a link to John Solomon's summary of the Comey's FBI 17 worst failures, inaccuracies, and omissions flagged in the Russia FISA report. And so in some respects, the things that people have been talking about in some of the other talk shows, turns out that they are all verified and confirmed in the FISA report. But you wouldn't know that by looking at some of the headlines that have surfaced in some of the mainstream media, which is why you have this very unprecedented phenomenon in which the Attorney General, hours after the Justice Department's Inspector General's report is released, that the Attorney General says, we disagree with some of the things in the report. And the person doing the most thorough investigation, John Durham, also disagrees with that as well. So this has been a history-making day in terms of the articles of impeachment. Yesterday was kind of historical in the sense that you've had people in the Justice Department contradicting other reports out of the Justice Department, and if nothing else, illustrates the reason why you maybe need to be listening to Point of View, reading more than just the headlines of some of these articles, reading widely and see if really we're even getting an accurate reporting on some of the things that have been reported by this investigation by the Justice Department. We come back, Martin Mawyer will be with us, Christian Action Network, problem with the IRS, which we're going to talk about right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. I just want to thank, first of all, Dr. Merrill Matthews for covering the program yesterday. I'll be here for the rest of the week, and I think today is a historic day. Not for necessarily good reasons, but it is historical because today you had the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, as well as the House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, joining the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, announcing 2 articles of impeachment will be brought against President Donald Trump. First charge will be obstruction of Congress, the second, abuse of power. Gerald Nadler said that today, in service to our duty to the Constitution and our country, the House committee introduces 2 articles of impeachment charging Donald Trump with committing high crimes and misdemeanors. The first one, of course, has to do with the issue of abuse of power. They argue that it's an abuse of power because of the July 25th phone call that President Trump made to the president of Ukraine. And the bottom line on that is, as we've said on this program so many times before, read the transcript and say, do you have anything that looks like a quid pro quo, anything looks like bribery, extortion, or most importantly, rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. And I think unless you just have a definite bias against the president and a bias towards impeachment, you probably come to the conclusion that no, that does not fit. But the second one is even more interesting: obstruction of Congress. Of course, some wags around Washington, D.C. right now are simply saying, how about the obstruction of the president by Congress? But here's the issue, which Katie Pavlich points out, and we're going to get into this more in the next hour because we have some very important guests to interview this hour. But I just might point out that the argument they make is that this is obstruction because the White House kept certain witnesses from testifying. Well, there's a remedy for that, and there have been other presidents who have said to various members of the executive branch, we don't want you to testify, and the legal recourse is to go to a court to compel various witnesses to do so. But in this rush to impeach, the 2 individuals, Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler, refused to do so. So this one has all the feeling of almost a trumped-up charge, but we'll get into more of that a little bit later. But nevertheless, the timeline is this. The Judiciary Committee will vote by the end of this week on articles of impeachment. There's every reason to believe that it probably will pass that committee, and then it will go to the floor of the House. And at that point, we'll see what happens, because there have been some, Representative Colin Peterson, who is a Democrat, for example, who voted against the impeachment procedures last time, who has said, I probably would vote against articles of impeachment, and you will see how many other Democrats will. And I think it's hard to imagine any Republicans that will. But nevertheless, today a very historic day in the sense of the articles of impeachment. But yesterday was a very historic day as well, because we had the release of the Inspector General report from the Department of Justice. We have as our first article here something by Al Perota, which actually has a link to the IG report if you'd like to read it. But the point that I think makes it so historic yesterday is literally hours after this is released by the Justice Department, The head of the Justice Department, which would be the Attorney General William Barr, basically said, we disagree with this. The Inspector General's report now makes it clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. And so while the media was telling us that there was no political bias, which I just simply disagree with, which we can talk about more in the next hour, but then if that's not enough, then you have the U.S. attorney by the name of John Durham, who actually is conducting a broader criminal investigation, which allows him to not only talk to people in the Department of Justice, but other entities in the U.S. that would be former members of the Justice Department. I think Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, John Durham, interviewing maybe James Comey. Who knows what they've done there? And people abroad. Think France, Germany, Ukraine. And he said, based on the evidence collected to date and while our investigation is ongoing, last month we advised the Inspector General we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to a predication and how the FBI case was opened. So in a matter of hours, you have people literally disagreeing with some of the things in the Inspector General's report, which itself talks about, 17 different errors, inaccuracies, misstatements, leaving out exculpatory information, which would be that would actually put a person in not guilty, people like Carter Page. So we'll get into more of that a little bit later. But I thought that it would be helpful for you to know a story that we've been following with our friends at the Christian Action Network. Christian Action Network was established by Martin Mawyer. You might remember the name. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, author of a number of books, Silent Shame, The Shocking Story of Child Sexual Abuse in America. And, of course, on a number of occasions, we've talked about his more recent book, Twilight in America, The Untold Story of Islamic Terrorist Training Camps Inside America. Well, it so happens that the IRS is basically in the process of closing them down because they argue, due now, they say, to some kind of clerical error, that actually you checked the wrong box to actually say that you no longer needed your 501c3 tax-exempt status. And as we get into this, I think you'll see that it wasn't a clerical error. But Martin, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Tell the story, because, we've talked about before that sometimes we hear the IRS say, well, that was just a clerical error. We didn't give some of these groups a 501c4 designation, but we just made a mistake. And I go, yeah, but you always made a mistake on the conservative groups. I don't see any example you made on the liberal groups. Here, you already kind of rattle the cages of the federal government with your investigations of terrorist training camps and things like that. And somehow the IRS just thinks that you actually wanted to close down your organization. Tell us more.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've been around for 30 years. 30 years. So it's not like we're a startup group that filed some forms with the IRS that accidentally closed our doors. We have professional people who fill out our forms. And I don't want to make it too complicated for people who are listening in, so let me see if I can make it as simple as possible. But every year, groups like us file a form called 990. On that form, there is a box that if you check it, you're admitting or conceding that you're shutting your organization down. Somehow or another, the IRS employee decided that we checked that box, and they submitted it into their computer system that Christian Action Network was shut down. But the employee did something additional to that as well. He moved up our termination date by 6 months.
Bingo.
So whereas it would have been shut down in July 2019, this individual moved it up to December 2018. So it sort of shows you a motive. Not only were we supposed to have shut our own organization down, but we wanted to make sure it happened even faster by moving the date up by 6 months.
Wow. Let me take a break, and then I want to come back and get into this in more detail. Right. But, and as a matter of fact, I was going to start with you, but, we have a few other things, the indictment of the President of the United States and an investigative report. But this is of concern because if you've been paying attention to us here at Point of View, if this could happen to a group like the Christian Action Network, it could happen to your local crisis pregnancy center, maybe your own church. So we're going to continue talking about this with Martin right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking with Martin Mawyer about what has been happening through the Christian Action Network and the IRS. And Martin, I might just mention I've got kind of this 4-page letter that was written by the chairman of your board to the Inspector General of the Treasury Department about this. And they also included one of the Form 990s. For people that are not familiar, every Christian organization other than churches have to file what's called a Form 990, a return of organization exempt from income tax. I can see on this particular era, it's a box checked X, either address change, amended return. There is a place for final return terminated, but that could be a mistake, except there are some other factors. One is the fact that they also moved the date up. And second of all, I just find it curious. I recognize that sometimes they're human errors, but why is it the errors always seem to happen against the conservative 501c3 and conservative 501c4 organizations and never the other way around? If it was just a clerical error, it'd be kind of 50-50 or even 60-40. But when it's 100-0, I don't know. I just wonder if there's something going on. What's your thoughts?
That's interesting because before you went to commercial break, you made the comment that this could happen to your church. The thing is, it could also happen to you as an individual. One of our other board members, the IRS has denied that individual the right to claim as tax deductible the gifts that he made to his church. So they won't even let him claim all the donations, tithing, everything, to that church as a tax deduction. He ended up taking it to his CPA, a certified public accountant, and an attorney. And they appealed it, and the IRS said, no, we're still not going to let you claim that money that you gave that church as a tax deduction. In the end, they added up the cost and benefit and realized that to file a lawsuit against the IRS would probably cost more than the benefit of being able to declare it as a deduction, so he just dropped the case. But see, if you have IRS employees who have a vendetta against you or an organization, something they don't like about you, then it's easy for them on their own, and I think that's what happened in this particular case, simply to cause havoc in the background. Now, this Treasury Inspector General's Office for Tax Administration was set up specifically to investigate IRS abuses. So we do like that. And I have a lot of confidence in them. They were the ones who were able to successfully bring to a conclusion the IRS versus the Tea Party people under the Obama administration. And besides that, it is their job. This is all they do is they look at the IRS and they follow up on complaints. And if they're not following up on complaints and doing a good job, it's going to be hard for them to get more money from Congress. So it's to their advantage to successfully conclude cases that work out in the advantage of if there is a possible violation, in advantage of the person that filed the grievance. So I'm hoping, praying that this is going to work out well for us. Now, just to be clear, we do have our tax-exempt status back. The IRS has, once again, reinstated our tax-exempt status. Nevertheless, we think the individual or individuals responsible for creating this havoc on us needs to be brought to some sort of justice. This is a big headache to an organization like us. I know it may not sound significant that your tax-exempt status was taken away, but you got to consider all the foundation gifts that we could have gotten this year did not come through because foundations were looking at the IRS, dialing up our number and finding out we were not tax deductible, therefore did not donate to us.
Yes.
The other major problem is that we do a lot of our fundraising through the mail. That mailing permit is dependent on our tax deduction. If I'm telling donors in the mail it's a tax deductible gift, and for the last 9 months it wasn't, that makes me liable for criminal fraud for all the thousands of pieces I put in the mail. And that's a lot of jail time. So, look, this was a very ruthless, evil. It was beyond, I guess, my expression that I could really say about how I feel what the IRS did to us. And I just hope that it is brought to a successful conclusion.
Let's just for a minute mention what you have been doing at the Christian Action Network. And I mentioned one of those. You had those blockbuster stories about some of these Islamic terrorist training camps inside the United States. More recently, we had you on to talk about what are called Muslim community patrol cars in New York City. These cars look just like they're part of the New York Best in Bright Blue. Again, there are just a number of stories that you've been taking on, including things like drag queens, homosexuality, and all the rest. So it's not surprising to me that, given the fact that you are located in Virginia, that there might be somebody in the IRS there living in Virginia go, wait a minute, I know what this organization is. We'll just check that box and we'll just close them down. And as a result, I don't have to use much of an imagination to even consider how this might have happened. What do you think?
Absolutely. And, we have an update on those Muslim community patrol cars. We have two what we would call confidential informants inside of that organization. And we were told a couple of weeks ago that the community itself in New York is getting very outraged at the conduct of these Muslim community patrol officers because they're acting like bullies and they're being described as gangster-like. And they're beginning to enforce Sharia law on people who are not Muslim. They gave me an example. For instance, on Friday night prayer services, if you are not a Muslim and you are using a legitimate parking space next to a mosque, they will turn the sirens on of their car, get out, and tell you you have to move your car, that you cannot park there because you're not a Muslim. Now, this is just the beginning infancy stages of trying to enforce Sharia on non-Muslims in New York City. And it's outraged a lot of the public over there because who are these people to tell you where you can and cannot park? As long as it's legal to park there, they should be allowed to park there. Another thing they're doing, and I don't know how your listeners will feel about this, but if they find people who have open containers of alcohol, they will take the can, sometimes they're described as kicking the can out of their hands and pouring it out on the streets because it's against the law in New York City to have an open container of alcohol. However, legally, that is resolved by a police officer giving them a citation, not taking their property and destroying it in front of them. And who are these people to take someone else's property and destroy it? But, that's part of their Sharia. You're not supposed to be drinking alcohol. So if they see it, they're going to take it from you. So a lot of the community members now are asking for a meeting with the district attorney. They want the district attorney to intervene and shut these cars down. And you can begin to see why, that both non-Muslims and Muslims themselves are not very happy with these patrol cars. And when I talked to you last time, they had 3 patrol cars on the street. They now officially have 7 patrol cars in New York City. Their ultimate goal, as I mentioned in a previous broadcast, that the goal is to get up to 30 of these cars running around the Big Apple.
Wow. Well, again, if you find yourself saying, he's been mentioning all sorts of things I want to read more about, you can simply go to their website, which we have on our website, or just go directly to christianaction.org. Matter of fact, the story they have there today is about that ISIS supporter there in the Bronx who actually was sentenced because he had hoped to be able to behead people with chainsaws. So you can read that, some of the things about transgender and a variety of other topics, all on the website. And, of course, the earlier studies that they've done on everything from child sexual abuse to training camps, all on their website. So we'll
And I add one more thing, Kirby. We have something on our website, a petition we would like people to sign. It's called In God We Still Trust. This July 4th, we have mobile billboard ads, 20-foot by 10-foot mobile billboards running in New York City and Washington, D.C., with a message on it, In God We Still Trust, and with a quote from the Supreme Court in 1892 that says the United States is a Christian nation. So I encourage people to go there and sign our petition and get on board with us on that campaign.
All that at christianaction.org. And Martin will keep everybody up to date on this. And if nothing else, I would encourage all of you that are part of 501c3 organizations, make sure that you are still up to date with the IRS and somebody didn't check a box that they shouldn't have checked. So appreciate you being with us. Merry Christmas, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Kirby. Appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, going to talk with our good friend Mary DeMuth. Last time we had her on, we did talk about her upcoming book, which is now out, 7 Deadly Friendships. And I thought during the Christmas season, when sometimes you have friends or family sitting across the table from you or interacting with you, you would benefit from a few of these deadly friendships that she talks about. And I thought we would kind of just get a little bit more information about that book and give you a chance to go and find it in your local bookstore. So then when we come back after her, next hour we'll get back into the indictments, the impeachment, the whole issue of the Inspector General report. We've just got a lot to cover, and we will do so. So stay tuned. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we want to bring to the microphone our good friend Mary DeMuth, author of 36 books, and we've had a chance to interview her on so many of those over the years. And this one is one we did mention before, but now it is out. It is available to you. Harvest House has published it, The 7 Deadly Friendships. And so if you find yourself saying, I really would like to get a copy of that book, and I think you would, you can probably find it in your local bookstore, but also we have a link to her website, marydemuth.com. There you can have a lot of other resources in terms of some of the things she's talked about in terms of sexual abuse, Praying for Everyone, the Pray Everyday podcast, all sorts of blogs and other resources. That is also available as well. But I thought it would be good to have her spend some time talking for just a few minutes about these individuals that you run into, especially during the Christmas season. They may be friends, they may be family, they may be narcissists, they may be very unreliable people, they may be the drama queens. How in the world do we address some of these people with these rather irregular personalities, deadly friendships? And so we bring back to the microphone Mary DeMuth. Thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. And I would just like to say that you are not a deadly friend. So thanks for that.
Well, that's good to know, because you and I know some. And, of course, we run into some of those. I mean, you speak almost every year at one of these Christian Writers Conferences. Of course, you just had one over there in Switzerland. Oh, I'd like to go and do that with you sometime, because you are such a gifted writer. But at the bottom line is we do run into those individuals. And you wrote about it in large part because you, like everyone else, runs into some of those kind of people on a pretty regular basis, don't you?
I do. And one of the things that I realized as I was writing this book is that I also can be some of these people. And so this is not a book about pointing the finger at all those bad people out there. It's also about pointing the finger back at us and asking ourselves, when are we being dramatic? When are we being narcissistic? And it's a good way to just kind of self-evaluate, especially as we begin the new year in 2020.
And what I like about the book, and I just give people a sense of the structure there, is that you sometimes will have certain traits and say, well, this is how this person acts. This is how this person behaves. And so, first of all, if you want to do a self-evaluation, you can say, okay, well, I checked that one. I guess I probably have to check that one too. Or I'll give my spouse and she'll check a lot more, or he will check a lot more than those. We know how that goes. But you have it in a really engaging format. 10 chapters, by the way, if you would want to read it by yourself. It's a great book. But also, I think this would be helpful if somebody would like to maybe develop a better case of body life within their small group, their Sunday school class, their church, to maybe identify some of those individuals who maybe even are participating and all of a sudden come under conviction that, boy, you know, even they're talking about this particular person called Con Man Connor. I kind of find a fit into that, or Unreliable Uma. I really probably am one of those. So this could also be, the way you've put it together, a possible small group study too, couldn't it?
It could, and it's all based on Proverbs 6, which is about the 7 deadly sins. And I realized that, you know, every sin is relational in some sort. And so as you look at these, you know, the haughty eyes and some of the things talked about in Proverbs 6, I basically just connected them to these personality types, and then, as you said, listed their traits and ways to kind of work through some of those. And this doesn't mean, okay, if this person is one of these 7 things, and they are, by the way, Narcissist Nolan, Unreliable Uma, Predator Paige, Conman Connor, Tempter Trevor, Faker Fiona, and Dramatic Drake, it doesn't mean that if you have someone like this in your life that you automatically don't be their friend anymore.
No.
It just is a way of kind of evaluating what you have in front of you and how to love better, and sometimes to create some boundaries. But it's not the kind of book that you just want to justify not having any friends. So I just want to make that clear.
That's good. And I might just mention, too, you did say Proverbs 6, which, of course, has those individual sins, if you will, 7 deadly sins. And, of course, there's even a movie about that. But then I did not realize this until I read this. There was a monk created a list of 8. Pope Gregory added a few more.
Yes.
So you can get some really long lists. But, again, you take the ones on haughty eyes, lying tongue, Hands That Kill the Innocent, or whatever it might be, and develop those. And since we only have a few minutes, let's pick out a couple. And we've said narcissist a couple of times, and so that's the first one. The narcissist Nolan, the haughty eyes. What are some of the kind of traits that we see there in terms of other people or maybe ourselves?
Right. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is when you leave someone that has especially narcissistic traits, you always kind of think of really good comebacks afterwards, but in the moment you're kind of stunned to silence in some of the things that they say to you. But a typical narcissist is based on that myth Narcissus, who wanted to look at themselves in the lake at their image all the time. And in this world of social media, we can see there's a lot of Narcissus out there. These are people who are self-absorbed, and everything is filtered through what they want and what their agenda is. And so you often will leave their presence feeling unseen, unheard, and kind of caught up in their own story and not in your own. And so they often demand special treatment, and they a lot of times in people that have like narcissistic personality disorder, they can't even really recount their childhood in strong, vivid memories. Everything has become about kind of play acting in the present tense about their grandiosity. And so it can be very exhausting and tiring to be around someone like that, particularly around this time of year in the holidays when you have relatives who are narcissistic. I remember being in a room with someone that was a relative that was narcissistic, and I had another relative that was also narcissistic, and two of us were sitting off to the side, and we just watched them one-up each other for about an hour. Well, this is a nice way to pass the time. We'll just watch them brag about themselves. It's
just
great.
Unbelievable. I know. It just, and we've all seen that happen. So, I mean, I'm laughing, but I'm sad. But given the interest of time, I wanted to at least get to a couple of others. And one, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Predator Page, because that's the hands that kill the innocent. And you have, of course, been such a great advocate over the years for people that have been sexually abused, and talk about 21 days for healing. And you have actually spoken out on this issue many times, written about this. And so I recognize that not all predators are sexual predators, but that predator really wants everything to come towards his or her advantage, right?
Exactly. And they gain strength by harming others. And I think that's something we have to be very cautious about in the church, because we're all about redemption, and I love redemption. I'm really for redemption. But there are wolves in sheep's clothing, and that's what a predator is. It's someone who may appear, they don't appear to be a predator on first glance, and they tend to be able to kind of hide in plain sight, and that's why it's so dangerous. We see that too in just the one who influences predatory people is Satan, who is a master of disguise as well, who disguises himself as an angel of light. So we just have to be super cautious and careful about people like this. And the problem with being with predatory people is that they are very good at manipulating their reputation. And so when you say, hey, this person harmed me, everybody else looks at you like you're crazy because they're the most awesome person ever. So that can be pretty insidious.
And again, you say narcissistic Ned and Predator Page have a hard time telling the actual truth. But also one other thing, he or she gaslights. Now, that phrase I've used in some of my commentaries, but I always have to explain it because it's an example of they'll say one thing one day, deny it the next, or they will eventually make you think you are the problem. And there was a book that came out years ago called Crazy Making, where the idea is if when you're with somebody that's like this, even though they're the one crazy, pretty soon they make you think you're the one that's crazy in the midst of that. And you start beginning to wonder about your own sanity, right?
Exactly. And if you were in a home that had people like this in it, one of the things that I had to do as a child is I had to write down what one of my particular parents said, because the next day they would deny saying it, and that was a form of gaslighting. I would think, maybe I'm crazy, maybe I didn't hear it, but because I wrote it down, I started to maintain my sanity. And sometimes people have to do that, to just write things down so they know what the truth is in the midst of some of those lies.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll chat for just a few more minutes with Mary DeMuth. This is a book that we could go through for an entire hour, but I just wanted to let you know that it does exist, and it is something that would help you heal some of those painful relationships that sometimes are eating away at your joy. 7 deadly friendships based, of course, on Proverbs. And then 3 very good chapters, Joseph, Jesus, and 7 life-giving practices on how to find health. So we'll come back and maybe I'll just pick out one more example. Then we'll talk about finding some health in the midst of this. And this book is published by Harvest House. Like so many of Mary's books, you probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to her website. And I would encourage you to get a copy of the book. As I mentioned before, you can read it individually, but I'm just thinking maybe this would be something that you might want to consider doing as a series in your small group. And as we're getting into the next year, some of you might be looking for a topic. This might be a very good one. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Mary DeMuth right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Legislative prayer is as old as the United States. In fact, offering a prayer before a public meeting should be one of the least questionable topics of our day. That's why some on the Cleveland City Council in Ohio would like to bring the practice back to its meetings. Thankfully, the law supports them if they do. Not only has the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the practice of legislative prayer twice, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit has even said that the lawmakers themselves can lead such invocations. That's partly why we litigated the American Legion versus AHA, where Justice Samuel Alito agreed with our understanding of the First Amendment and noted that religiously expressive practices, such as legislative prayer, that have long been a part of our nation's history and heritage, bear, quote, a strong presumption of constitutionality. Well, just a few weeks later, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Fields versus Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives noted that the presumption of constitutionality that they spoke of in the American Legion case also extends to legislative prayers. As we recently explained in a letter we sent to the council members, the Cleveland City Council is on solid legal ground to restart its practice of legislative prayers, extending that level of freedom to all Americans, whether they are private citizens or elected officials, reflects the very best of the American brand of freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Mary DeMuth with us today as we talk about 7 deadly friendships. Thought we'd pick out one more and then talk about some solutions. Dramatic Drake certainly comes to mind, a person who sows discord in a family. And, of course, I use the idea of a drama queen, which is partially the case. But it could be others where these are individuals, everybody telling everybody else to chill out, but they're just all over the place. And they are sometimes paranoid. Sometimes they have wide mood swings. They can just be as exhausting as some of the others that you just mentioned, can't they?
They can, and this is one of the ones that I struggle with personally. I think part of that is that because I grew up with a lot of chaos, when I don't have chaos, I feel weird. Chaos is more comforting for me. And so people who are dramatic can have that bent toward them where they feel like if there's not chaos or there's not drama, then everything's kind of boring or it's just not how they want it. And so they create that drama. So we have to be careful in our own selves that we don't run around trying to create drama, but also that we don't feed someone else's need for drama. I think we can cause that to escalate by asking more questions and kind of getting absorbed in it, and we have to be careful not to feed it.
And this is the kind of person that if they have a bad day, it's the end of the world, but they might have a really good day and just part of it was bad. And you sort of need to be able to kind of talk them off the edge of the building or whatever it might be. But let's, if I can, people can certainly identify with 7, or even if you want to go to some of the longer list of individuals that are very exhausting friends. But you have a part 2. You give us Joseph and Jesus and also 7 life-giving practices. Let's talk for just a few minutes, Mary, about how to address these and what we can do individually in our own lives, but how we can maybe help some people around us applying some of these biblical principles.
Yeah, so, it's one thing to highlight frustration. It's another to kind of help people walk and navigate that. And part of that is that we also, all of us need to look at our own past and look at how maybe we have lived in a reaction to our past. And a lot of times we have these dysfunctions because we haven't dealt with something in our heart that needs to be healed. And so part of that, one of those life-giving practices is just to examine ourselves and to see what it is that God's saying to us and where those broken places are that we can be healed. And then, of course, to embrace more healing from Him. We also can invert someone's behavior, which this has been one of the ones that have been really helpful to me. Sometimes I would get so upset by someone harming me or hurting my feelings or doing something that was destructive that it would just cause me to spiral. And I think a lot of us during the holidays are in this experience where someone's, having this negative effect on us. And so what I've learned to do over the years has been to look at that behavior, name it in my mind as bad, like I don't want to be that way, and then put a holy stake in the ground and say, okay, I am not going to be this way. I'm going to invert their behavior. I'm going to use their behavior as a cautionary tale for me to decide what not to do.
Yes. And one of the tremendous values in the book, and there are many, is you talk about how Jesus interacted with all 7 of these people. I never thought about this till I read your book. The rich young ruler is kind of the narcissistic Nolan because, he says, I didn't sin. Peter, he denies Jesus, so he's kind of like the unreliable Uma. You have, of course, a couple of others that fit into those categories. How about Judas, like predatory Page and things of that nature? As well as you can go all the way down to even at the end, Thomas, let's go too, I'll die with Jesus. And he's kind of like dramatic Drake. And you say kind of each one of these individuals at one time or another not only surfaces in our life, they surface in the pages of Scripture. So you really have some possible answers there as well. So I just thought it was a wonderful book. I wanted to bring you back to talk about it. 200 pages, published by our good friends at Harvest House. But just before we go, I always like to feature your website, Mary. It's marydemuth.com. If you don't know how to spell her name, it's really easy. But even if you don't, we've got the link there because you have material about sexual abuse for our listeners that are not familiar. You certainly have written about that over the years. You've done stuff on the Restory, as well as you have been so dedicated to praying, and you even have a Pray Everyday podcast. So for just a moment, talk about some of the resources there. And let me also mention that if you'd like to have Mary come and speak, you can click on that button there for speaking as well, because she would just be outstanding to address so many different issues. An author that's written 36 books obviously can speak on just about any topic you would want. And so let me encourage you to go to the website. But when people land on the website, what are some of the resources you're making available right now to our listeners?
Yeah, so lots of free stuff, including the Pray Everyday podcast, which is basically what that sounds like. So I read a scripture. Currently, we're working through the book of Romans, and then I pray for the person. And it takes about 5 minutes. And I pray according to the scripture. And so it's been really fun. We're in over 130 countries now, 500,000 downloads. And so it's been really cool. So it's something like to give to someone who maybe feels like no one in the whole wide world is praying for them. So that's there. I've got lots of resources for people struggling and lots of blog posts. And my heart in that site is to help people grow.
And I might just mention, even as I was talking about speaking, I mean, a lot of people say, well, I could have him speak for a women's retreat or all sorts of other things. I hope people would have you come and speak for missions, because you and your family, of course, were missionaries to France. And that's really the first time I met you after you'd come back. You've written about millennials. You've written about, of course, this whole idea of abuse and a variety of other topics. So you can click on the button there that says speaking. You can click on the button that says store. I see you have some art there as well as all of your books. So there's just all sorts of resources that I think people will find as they go to marydemuth.com. And I hope people will think about inviting you to come and speak. And, of course, I've always appreciated hearing you speak at the various Christian writer conferences. So it is just a delight to have you on the program. And so let's do it again. And as always, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, too. Thanks so much.
Let's take a break. When we got back, we've got a couple of other issues to get into. The first is, okay, we're going to spend some time talking about these articles of impeachment. What are they? What will happen? What's the timeline? Are there some questions that are being raised about this? And then number two, we also want to talk about the Inspector General's report. I gave you a little bit of a comment at the outset, but we're going to give it about a half an hour as we can to get into some of those topics. And then before the end of the show today, we've got a good friend coming in to talk about this new one-year Pray for America Bible. Do you think we need to pray for America? Of course, we know the answer for that. And as we're getting too close to the new year, we wanted you to start off by praying for very important prayer topics. And this Bible is one of many ways in which you probably can certainly do that. But Dave Thornton is the Bible brand director for Tyndale House in Carroll Stream, Illinois. He's worked also with other groups like David C. Cook and Gospel Light and a variety of others. But we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of praying for America. And that's a good way to kind of end the next hour after we will have spent a good portion of our time talking about these articles of impeachment, making this a very historic day, as well as the Inspector General report, which made yesterday a very historic day when you have the head of the Justice Department just a few hours after the Justice Department issues its report, disagreeing with the report. I don't know that I've ever seen that before. And then also the ongoing investigation by U.S. Attorney John Durham, who's basically saying, you know what? Oh, it's a whole lot worse than what you are reading right now. What you're reading is bad enough, but when we issue our report, there are probably going to be indictments and even convictions. So we've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so. If you find yourself saying, I need to read some of this, we've got those articles on the website. We've got the link to Mary DeMuth and Martin Mawyer, and we'll even have the link, of course, to the Pray for Bible, America Bible. So all of that's available at the website, pointofview.net, and go there. You can click on that button that says Donate. We would greatly appreciate your gift, especially before year end. If you can help us out, we'd appreciate that, and we'll be back with more right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Articles of impeachment being drawn up will be voted on by the end of this week by the House Judiciary Committee, then going to the full House next week. We'll see what happens there. Of course, the announcement given today by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, the House Intelligence Committee Chairman, Adam Schiff, and the House Judiciary Committee Chairman, Jared Nadler, calling for articles of impeachment for two reasons. Number one, an abuse of power. Number two, obstruction of Congress. As I mentioned just a minute ago, but let's come back to this again in case you didn't happen to be listening. The issue of abuse is an argument that this phone call that President Trump actually made to the president of Ukraine on July 25th is an abuse of power. Even if you accept that as a quid pro quo, which I don't think that it is, and in just a minute I'm going to quote from an individual that's hardly a Trump supporter, but nevertheless even assumes that this might have been coercion. It's certainly not impeachable. But if you actually go and read the transcript, and I would encourage you to do so if you are on the other side, and tell me where you see that quid pro quo or that threat of extortion or bribery, you're not going to find it, as you well know. And that is, if you will, bad enough. But the worst of these is the argument that this is an obstruction of Congress. Now, as I said last hour, there's a bunch of wags around Washington, D.C. that are Republicans and others that are saying, well, what about the obstruction of the president by Congress all these years? But that's not the point here. It is the argument that because the White House has, and some people say blocked witnesses, they just encourage them not to, that is an obstruction of Congress. And yet the reality is this is not the first time, nor will it be the last time, that a president instructs or encourages members of his cabinet or of the administration not to testify. But there is a very simple legal remedy, which has been used for decades, really millennial almost, but let's go down to at least the United States, 2 centuries of going to the courts and then compelling witnesses. But there's a rush to impeachment right now, and so that is the article that is being used and the argument being used. This is going to put a number of Democrats in a really difficult situation. 2 of the Democrats last time did not even vote for the formalizing of an impeachment process. One of those is Representative Colin Peterson, who pretty much thinks he will vote against the articles of impeachment. I'm certainly leaning that way. I think it is just too divisive for the country. It doesn't accomplish anything. But how many others are going to wish they could vote that way? We'll have to see where that takes us. Which brings me to a couple of columns, one by John Cass, one by Cal Thomas. John Cass, I wanted to kind of be fair here, is probably not by any stretch of the imagination much of a Trump supporter. He's a columnist for the Chicago Trib, which is important because we're going to come back to Chicago in just a minute. But nevertheless, he points out that the reason some of this is happening is because American unemployment numbers are at a 50-year low, with people working and with money in their pockets. Stubborn House Democrats rush toward a path towards, he calls it madness. He calls it self-destructive. Democrats push forward on impeachment. And he basically says, let's face the fact that the president probably did, and he's agreeing with something I disagree with, linked military assistance to an investigation of the Bidens. But then he goes back and says, yes, but you have the Bidens rolling in Ukraine. Joe was an Obama administration's point man there, son of Hunter, was making $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian gas company. Joe Biden threatened to kill a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee unless the prosecutor was fired. Guess what? The prosecutor was fired. Joe Biden bragged about it on video. So the question that John Cass puts is, who's got clean hands in this? Because he thinks Trump is guilty, and he also for sure believes that the Bidens are guilty. And he says, if in anything, it looks just kind of like what you have to deal with in Chicago. You won't find any angels. So he's much more critical of the president, accepts the premise, which I don't. But even if you do, he's arguing maybe the Congress should consider censuring the president, rather than impeaching him, because without offering real proof and not bother to wait for a court battle to compel witnesses from the White House to testify, see, there's that point again. What is the Democrat rush to impeachment about? He said it's political, it's about leverage for fundraising, it's self-destructive. I have another answer, and that is I think they want to get out in front of this second report that's going to come from John Durham, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But there's another piece that came out by Cal Thomas. I've oftentimes read Cal's comment, but I hadn't actually seen it until I saw or heard an interview that was done with somebody in the Trump campaign that said the reason, according to Cal Thomas, that all this is taking place is because of the good jobs report and the stock market. But he starts out by saying, well, with apologies to Elton John, can you feel the love tonight? No. Can you feel the hate tonight? And he talks about the fact that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked by reporter James Rosen, used to be with Fox News, now is independent, if she hates Donald Trump. She responded with, if looks could kill, fire in her eyes, and denounced Rosen for his question while claiming she doesn't hate Trump. Talks about Vice President Joe Biden, who was out there in Iowa. An 83-year-old man asked how his son could get such a lucrative job when he lacked experience in the field. Biden, of course, called him a name. I'll leave it to that, and challenged him to a push-up contest. But the one that disturbs me the most, and it's one that I think just illustrates a lot of concern about how the left has become unhinged, is what has happened to George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. You had 4 law professors the other day. 3 basically argued for the impeachment of the president. Jonathan Turley, who is not a Trump supporter, did not vote for President Trump, on many occasions has been very supportive of the Democrats, but nevertheless argued that there was no justification for impeachment. And interestingly enough, he says, my home and my office were inundated with threatening messages and demands that I be fired from George Washington University. Now, you've got to understand that he was the individual who was last to testify, and then later Representative Ken Buck, representative from Colorado, he's the one that said, using the standard your other 3 law professors have used for impeachment, would that then apply to like Lyndon Johnson when he directed the CIA to spy on his presidential opponent, Barry Goldwater? Yeah. Would it apply when Franklin Roosevelt directed the IRS to conduct audits of his political opponents? And gives the list. Yeah. Would it apply when President Kennedy directed his brother, then the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Well, again, he goes along with that. And even when Roosevelt signed an executive order to intern and actually place 120,000 Japanese Americans behind wire-controlled bars. And it's just like, so he was simply trying to inject some common sense into the discussion about these articles of impeachment. And his life is almost ruined because he's getting all sorts of threatening messages and people demanding that he be fired from George Washington University Law School, when, if anything, he's been a much better proponent for the Democrats than he ever was for the Republicans. But that's what happens when you speak some common sense in a House hearing. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me, if I can, continue with the Cal Thomas piece, because he talks about, of course, what happened to Jonathan Turley. But then he goes on to say that maybe what's behind this is last Friday's jobs report. And if you were listening to Point of View on Friday, you know that we talked about that with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Chelsea Human. And by the way, Kelly Shackelford will be with us this Friday, and I think Chelsea will be back as well. And again, just to summarize how CNNBC talked about it, non-farm payroll surged by 266,000 in November, better than the 187,000 expected. Unemployment rate ticked down to 3.5%, matching the lowest job rate since 1969. End of the GM strike had a big effect, boosting employment in motor vehicles and parts by 41,000. And, of course, average hourly earnings rose by 3%. And then you have all the other things. Well, first of all, of course, the Dow Jones scored 337 points that day. But then you have unemployment, record lows for African American, record lows for Hispanic American. And because there were a number of polls, Emerson, Marist, and Rasmussen, that show the president at 30% or now 34% or higher, is that a concern? And he says this what maybe scares and angers Democrats. If they lose significant numbers of black voters, they're toast. That's, again, Cal Thomas's comment. He said Democrats have taken the black vote for granted. They've talked a good game, but failed to deliver with jobs and better education opportunities, such as school choice. And he said if the hatred seems bad now, and it is, imagine what it will be like should President Trump have the opportunity to name another justice to the Supreme Court. It will make the hatred directed at Brett Kavanaugh seem tame. And that kind of relates to my commentary yesterday on Supreme Court term limits. A lot of people have been watching the health of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, you know, every time she gets sick, every time she enters the hospital, some people say, what's next? And one suggestion that has come both from some Republicans, some Democrats, even from some members of Congress and some members of the Supreme Court, is maybe we need to think about having very long-term limits. And one group has suggested term limits of maybe 18 years, which would then be staggered so that each 2 years a vacancy would come up. Because you have some presidents that get to make 3 nominations. Ronald Reagan fits into that category. Others, like Jimmy Carter, get 0. And so you could see what that might mean. So that was, of course, yesterday's commentary. But before I run out of time, let me also talk about the Inspector General's report. Because when it came out yesterday on December 9th, you had this report from the Inspector General of the Justice Department, who's Michael Horowitz. You had a number of various news outlets that immediately rushed out with the headline, no evidence of intentional misconduct or political bias. No evidence of bias is how a lot of them said that. And yet, if you started reading through the report, which is 476 pages, so it takes a little bit of time, you can begin to see that, wait a minute, the report documents more than a dozen, actually 17, basic, fundamental, and serious errors in the application for a FISA warrant, which allows you to spy on individuals. And so, interestingly enough, you have even the Department of Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, indicated their office was so concerned that it was now launching a new audit of the FISA process. But nevertheless, as Gary Bauer points out in his piece yesterday, the Inspector General has been able to see bias when staring him in the face, he says. He says all you have to do is look at some of the texts by Peter Strzok, for example, and saying that the evidence of bias does not pass the straight face test, which is why very quickly you had something that I just don't know has happened very often. And Britt Hume has been around Washington, D.C. a long time. As a matter of fact, when I met him back in the 1970s, he was working for Jack Anderson at the time. I was vice president of the student body, and I was asked to introduce him to the group. And so in the 1970s, he was already in Washington, D.C. So he's been around a long time. He says, I can remember a time in which, after the Justice Department issues a report, within hours, the head of the Justice Department, the Attorney General, goes, wait a minute, we disagree with some of the things in the report. The Attorney General, William Barr, basically says the Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. It is also clear that from its inception, the evidence produced by the investigation was consistently exculpatory. I'll explain that word in just a minute. Nevertheless, the investigation and surveillance was pushed forward for the duration of the campaign and deep into the President Trump's administration. In the rush to obtain and maintain FISA surveillance, the Trump campaign officials, FBI officials, misled the FISA court, omitted critical exculpatory facts from their filings, and suppressed or ignored information negating the reliability of their principal source. And the Inspector General found the explanations given for these actions unsatisfactory. Well, Gary Bauer goes on to say, for those of us that are not versed in legal jargon, it is critical to note here that exculpatory evidence or facts means information that exonerates someone of guilt. Or he says, in other words, the Attorney General of the United States just accused the FBI of hiding information that cleared Carter Page and Donald Trump. And so one of the articles we've posted here is by our friend Al Perrotta, has been on the program with us before, in which he points out that there are 17 different failures or significant inaccuracies that were used in securing these warrants against a Trump campaign official, which is Carter Page. He goes through and reminds us that here, after this presentation is made, interestingly enough, you have the Attorney General, William Barr, who basically says this whole investigation was based on the thinnest of suspicions and really insufficient to justify those actions. then goes on to talk about how they misled the court, they omitted key information, and on and on and on. And, of course, that whole statement, if you'd like to read it, is linked on the website, including the 476-page Inspector General report. No, I'm not going to read it either, but if you want to read it, it is there. But just before we take a break and get into our conversation about the one-year Pray for America Bible, I thought I'd also just very quickly read from John Durham. They might say, who is he? Well, John Durham is the U.S. attorney who, because he's doing a wider range investigation, is able to do quite a number of things. And Al Perota puts it this way: if Barr's take was not enough, U.S. Attorney John Durham has given James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, and a variety of other people in the DOJ, FBI cabal real reason to worry, because John Durham is conducting a broader criminal investigation, not limited to developing information from within the Justice Department. Understand that when we are talking about the investigation being done by those in the Inspector General's department, Michael Horowitz, they could really only talk to people that are currently in the Justice Department. They couldn't talk to people outside of it, and they certainly couldn't talk to other people in other countries. But here it says he's been developing information from persons and entities in the U.S. and abroad. What might those be? As I mentioned just a minute ago, I don't know. It could be like France, Germany, maybe even England because of the whole issue of the Steele dossier. How about Ukraine? And so, interestingly enough, John Durham issued a statement yesterday, quote, based on the evidence collected to date, and while our investigation is ongoing, last month we advised the Inspector General that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to the predication or how the FBI case was opened, unquote. Remember that a couple of weeks ago, we even announced, and of course that's in the report, that one FBI agent actually manipulated, changed some of the filings in some of the emails. So first of all, you've got that. You've got the obvious political bias of those individuals that are illustrated by what we have in their texts and their emails and a variety of other things. But I always like to just say, okay, I'll concede the point. Let's just a moment say there was no political bias. I don't believe it for a second. And all of this is due to incompetence. Does that make you feel any better? I mean, we are able to actually use a whole apparatus which was developed so that we could investigate potential terrorism in America. And we turn this on an individual in the Trump campaign and use that then to surveil, better word is spy, on him and any conversation he had with anybody in the Trump campaign. And this continued on even after Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And if that makes you feel good, then there's something wrong with you. But if it causes you to lose some sleep at night, that's the kind of reason why this investigation needs to take place. Well, with that as background, aren't you ready to pray for America? That's what we'll be talking about next. David Thornton will be with us. We'll be talking about the one-year Pray for America Bible right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about prayer and the Bible, because we'll be talking about the one-year Pray for America Bible. And it comes from our friends at Tyndale. And I love one of the press releases. Already sick of presidential election year politics? Yes. Already sick of, I would add this, they didn't have this there, the indictment, impeachment, and everything else. Yes, and it's maybe time for us to do something we talk about so often and try to accomplish here at Point of View, and that is to encourage you to pray for this nation. And this is another resource that we wanted you to know about, because it kicks off, obviously, January 1, and it takes you through the entire year. And there's just a great opportunity for you to then not only read through the Bible, but you have some suggested prayer requests each day. Then it features everything from some of the prayer proclamations by George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, National Day of Prayer by Billy Graham or by Vonette Bright, or some of the information about, for example, the D-Day radio broadcast by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or whatever it might be. And I think you're going to appreciate having this Bible, and I think you're going to appreciate some of the conversation that we're going to have right now. Might also mention the foreword to this Bible comes from Barry Black, who's the chaplain of the United States Senate. And so he says that we should get back to praying for our government, because life should not be divided into sacred and secular. God has sovereignty over all of our lives, because in him we live, move, breathe, and function, which, of course, is a quote that actually the Apostle Paul used when he was at Mars Hill from one of the ancient poets, interestingly enough. Just a little footnote there. So we bring to the microphone Dave Thornton, who is the Bible brand director at Tyndale House, an individual that in the past has worked with, for example, David C. Cook and Gospel Light and others, a graduate from Bethel University, with also having a master's degree from Trinity International University, and joins us now by phone. David, thank you so much for joining us here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you and your listeners about this tool we've created to help people spend more time in the Bible and spend more time on their knees and praying for this great nation that we call our home.
Well, again, it's just an outstanding opportunity from January 1st to December 31st, from Genesis to Revelation, all those kinds of things, to really spend time in God's Word and to spend time in prayer. I tried to give a brief overview, but help us understand this, because each day there is an opportunity for people to read a particular passage. Obviously, if you go to Genesis, you have the first two chapters in Genesis, but then it also has the first two chapters in Matthew and a couple of other things that you can do as well, something from the Psalm and Proverbs. So in a sense, you're not just necessarily always reading chronologically through the Bible, but you also, in addition to the chronology, also are focusing on some of the thematic ideas. But tell us through really how this actually works and how we can use it next year.
Sure. Well, our founder, Ken Taylor, had a vision to help people read the Bible, and he and his friends, and this really goes back to the 70s, sometimes struggled when they would try to read through the Bible on an annual basis when they got bogged down in books like Leviticus or Numbers. And so he really came up with this idea of a daily Bible that included a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from the Psalms, a reading from the Proverbs, and a reading from the New Testament. And in that way, you're kind of getting a dose of each of the major segments of God's Word, and it keeps it interesting as you're reading through the text of the Bible. And over the course of a year, you actually read the Psalms twice, but you'll read everything in the Old and New Testament, the Psalms twice, and all of the Proverbs. So it helps people stick with those New Year's resolutions of wanting to read through the Bible in 2020. But in light of the 2020 election year, we felt that what could really be a blessing to people, Kerby, would be to have daily prayer prompts that sprung off of that day's scripture reading and gave people words to speak in at times when it can be challenging. So I'll give you an example. The reading for January 6th comes from Genesis 13, where Abraham and Lot were quarreling. And our prayer prompt for that day says, Lord, our country isn't perfect. You know that, and you see us for who we are. So I pray for your salvation, trusting you'll give us hope and healing, not because we deserve it, but because of your vast, unfailing love. Work in and through this nation, Lord. Amen.
And again, I think the point that you're making here is that each day there is something that is in that particular scripture which will point to something that we find unfolding before our very eyes. And so I think that is helpful. But I thought just before we take a first break and we'll get into some more of the details, I thought it was also striking that you have the foreword by Barry Black. And, of course, he is the current chaplain of the U.S. Senate. When you think of some of the other famous chaplains, you think of Peter Marshall and Lloyd John Ogilvie, Richard Halverson, and some others. But here is just an admonition from him to be praying for our nation every day. And I read just a minute ago this idea that we shouldn't have this sacred and secular, whether we're learning about Abraham and whether we're learning about later Daniel or David or someone else, we recognize that it is important for us to pray for our political leaders, and we can learn a lot of biblical principles from the Old and New Testament when we look at those individuals that were put in position of leadership, can't we?
That's right. Yeah, we heard Dr. Black preach a sermon that was quite powerful at the 2017 National Prayer Breakfast, and we actually had him expand on that message, and Tyndale had the privilege of publishing his book, Your Voice Made Heard in Heaven, that sprung off of that. But because of our relationship with him, we approached him with this idea, and he was thrilled to provide us a foreword. And Barry believes in the power of God's word to change lives and to change the lives of government officials. In fact, he gives a copy of our Life Application Study Bible to every incoming U.S. senator when they join the Senate. And so he's been a big fan of the New Living Translation and of getting God's word into the hands of our elected officials there in the U.S. Senate.
If this is something that people would want to make available at Christmas time, or maybe make available for their Sunday school class or something like that, you have, of course, 365 sections that people can read, but there might be a way that as people go to their bookstore to order these, but if they wanted to get these in mass or in bulk and use this for something for their prayer group, is that a possibility too?
Yes, absolutely. And we love all of our retail partners that make our Bibles available. So people could approach their favorite local Christian bookstore or Christian book distributors if that's who they like to support, or they could contact us directly here at Tyndale, and we'd be happy to talk about any special discounts based on bulk or the size of the order if someone's interested in exploring that.
One of the things that came out the other day, which, if I don't mind me quoting you back to you, this is one book that every Christian in America should have under their Christmas tree this year. Don't go into the election year fray without a Bible reading plan that will keep you in the Word, and that includes specific timely prayers for the nation each day. And as you gave us an example there, just in January, every one of these is an attempt to force us back into some of these aspects of Scripture. But then you also still have some of the Bible commentaries, just a couple of footnotes along the way in case people need to have that. And then, of course, some really good prayers like, Lord, you granted King Asa and Israel a time of peace and rest. We could use peace and rest too. I pray for this nation to experience peace, rest, and renewal in you. So that is one of those prayers that is listed there in July. And so when we come back from the break, I'd like to maybe have you pick out a couple of other things that we can talk about. And in particular, we haven't really mentioned, but let's come back in just a second to talk about the fact that you have a number of full-page prayers, the prayers of Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and, of course, the foreword by the Senate chaplain Barry Black. And so if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a copy of this Bible, and I would like to use it, you can certainly look for it in your local bookstore, and we encourage you to do so, but we also have made it very easy for you to get that. We have a link so that you can get it in paperback or in Kindle, And so this would be an opportunity for you to have it with you, either in printed form, or I know a lot of you millennials, you'd only read the Bible now when it's on a screen. Okay, well, it can come on your screen there as well. And so we've made it very easy for you to carry this Bible around. And I really encourage everyone, as we oftentimes have a Pray for America campaign here at Point of View, now we have a Pray for America Bible, and it's a one-year Bible that will allow you to read through the Bible in 1 year, which I highly recommend that you do. And at the same time also have all sorts of suggested prayers that you can pray. So we'll continue our conversation with David Thornton. He, of course, is the Bible brand director at Tyndale House, just a great publishing house, so many good books there. And when we come back, we'll get a couple of other ideas about how to use this just before we wind down today. We have an impeachment going on. We need to pray for America. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Legislative prayer is as old as the United States. In fact, offering a prayer before a public meeting should be one of the least questionable topics of our day. That's why some on the Cleveland City Council in Ohio would like to bring the practice back to its meetings. Thankfully, the law supports them if they do. Not only has the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the practice of legislative prayer twice, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit has even said that the lawmakers themselves can lead such invocations. That's partly why we litigated the American Legion versus AHA, where Justice Samuel Alito agreed with our understanding of the First Amendment and noted that religiously expressive practices, such as legislative prayer, that have long been a part of our nation's history and heritage, bear, quote, a strong presumption of constitutionality. Well, just a few weeks later, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Fields versus Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives noted that the presumption of constitutionality that they spoke of in the American Legion case also extends to legislative prayers. As we recently explained in a letter we sent to the council members, the Cleveland City Council is on solid legal ground to restart its practice of legislative prayers, extending that level of freedom to all Americans, whether they are private citizens or elected officials, reflects the very best of the American brand of freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the one-year Pray for America Bible. And again, we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or in Kindle. But we also have a link to Tyndale.com and then /one-year Bible. But you don't have to remember all that because we already have the link. Stay in the Word and on your knees. And it has information about the one-year Pray for America Bible. You can click on the button that says Try It Out. You can read this month's reading plan. And then, of course, you can buy it and select a retailer. But if you find yourself saying, well, I've just wanted just kind of a basic one-year Bible, we have all sorts of others that are available there as well. There is the one-year Bible as well as the chronological Bible. There's kind of a journaling Bible. And I tend to use one of those sometimes, especially when I travel to Israel, because I then put most of my notes in the margin there, and so then I just only have to have my Bible and no notes, because you're running around in those situations. Sometimes when I'm outdoor preaching at a National Day of Prayer, those journaling Bibles I found really helpful, because you can put some of your notes in the side, and if you've memorized most of it, you just need some thought joggers to get you started. So that is all available, and you can go to Tyndale.com. Of course, find out all sorts of other great books by Tyndale. I can't even count the number of Tyndale books I have on my shelf, and it is just a privilege to have for a few more minutes Dave Thornton with us, Bible Brand Director at Tyndale House in Carroll Stream. Just before we get into maybe one or two other examples, I really haven't spent a whole lot of time talking with you about these full-page prayers. You have Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. You have some modern ones as well after 9/11. You have the original first prayer that took place at the First Continental Congress. And you have a prayer by Reverend Peter Marshall, who I mentioned just a minute ago. So talk about that, because those are additional inserts that I think people are going to find very helpful.
Yeah, so it was a privilege to be a part of the team that selected those inserts, and we were looking for historic prayers that really were quite poetic and important as a part of our country's history. So as you mentioned, we have prayers from presidents, we have prayers from evangelical leaders like Billy Graham and Vonette Bright, who spoke at the National Day of Prayer. But another example, we have some hymns in there, and
yes,
even a patriotic song. It was surprising to me to discover the fourth verse of the patriotic song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," that I didn't learn at my public school, but the fourth verse says, "Our fathers, God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King." So we just have some fun, I think, poetic prayers that are inserted throughout the Bible that are treated with a nice four-color approach that just helps them to stand out just a bit more from the daily prayer prompts that spring right off of that day's text of Scripture.
And I might just mention that you're going to find these helpful, because if you've ever been around when we talked about D-Day, we oftentimes even play the audio of the prayer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the radio broadcast, and the prayer he did that day on June 6, 1944. You know that we just recently had a conversation about George Washington and whether he's a Christian or not. Of course he was. Abraham Lincoln, oftentimes when we talk about National Day of Prayer, or sometimes during Thanksgiving, their proclamation there for a national day of fast is there as well. And I mentioned just in passing that people aren't aware that you have some really great prayers there as well that have surfaced as a result of things like 9/11. And so that is a prayer that is in there, as well as a couple of other songs and hymns. So these are great resources, all bound up in one book, which is, of course, the Bible. Can you give us at least maybe one other example that you had of a prayer that you found very helpful as you put together 365 of those? That is a monumental work. But what else would you share with us?
Yeah. Well, you know, Kerby, part of what was fascinating in organizing this was we discovered in our research that Christians in America aren't all in agreement on what to do with thorny issues. And so we discovered that of people who read the Bible and pray daily, 40% are Democrats, 40% are Republicans, and 20% are independents. And so we framed the structure of this Bible to be truly nonpartisan. And so I'll give you a good example. Take a topic like immigration. It's quite heated in our country today. But when we had the reading on February 5th, which comes out of Exodus chapter 21, in Exodus 22, verse 21, the Bible tells us you must not mistreat or oppress foreigners. So here's the way we approached a prayer on immigration. We said, Lord, you call your people to not oppress or mistreat foreigners. Immigration is a key issue, a discussion where emotions run high. Give our leaders wisdom in balancing national interests with compassion. They need your wisdom, Lord, as do I. Amen.
And again, I thought that was very well done. And again, you have on that day, which would be February 5th, Exodus 21 to 23. Then you read Matthew 24, 1 to 28. You read Psalm 29, 1 to 11, and Proverbs 7, 6 to 23. So again, you get Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, Proverbs. Just very well done. And it's just a great resource. So again, one more time, if people want to just get a copy, I encourage them to go to their local bookstore. We always want to support our local Christian bookstore, but if you're not near a bookstore or you can't find it there, you can contact individuals. But I suspect, David, I'm just getting this sense that there are going to be some people who say, I'm head of our prayer ministry at the church. I want to make sure every one of our people on my prayer committee get one. I'm going to just see if I can buy 10 of these and distribute them the next time we get together, or maybe have a small group, and let's just make a point that each time we get together, we'll at least pray the prayer for that week or one of the prayers that week. And so if people want to get bulk amounts, they can find out through their local bookstore or contact you there at Tyndale. And we just wanted to feature it because we certainly believe in the need to pray for America, especially on this historic day when it looks like articles of impeachment will be brought against the President of the United States. So, David, I appreciate the good work you do there at Tyndale. I so value the books that I have on my shelf from Tyndale, and thank you for taking some time to join us today and talk about the 1-year Pray for America Bible.
Thanks so much, Kerby, for having me. And a quick note, that Kindle edition you mentioned is on sale for limited time at launch for $1.99.
Wow.
So for those who would like to check it out digitally, for a limited time, it's really just for the next week. It'll be priced that way on Amazon and Google and the other places people might seek out their digital versions of books.
Well, that sounds like something I'm going to go do right after we get out of the program here, and I hope some other people will do it as well. Thank you, David, and Merry Christmas, and we look forward to the next opportunity to talk.
Merry Christmas to you and all your listeners. Thanks so much for hosting me today. God bless you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention tomorrow, Kathy Cook will be with us, and we'll be talking about a couple of issues related to education and raising your kids, so I think you'll appreciate that. But I suspect over the next couple of days, the idea of the impeachment, articles of impeachment, are going to sort of dominate our news. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. We're going to have a chance to hear from some of our experts in that regard. Let me just give you a program note. John Smerick will be with us on Thursday. And of course, you've seen and heard him before as an individual that writes for the Stream. And then, of course, we're going to have our roundtable conversation. I can't wait to find out what Kelly Shackelford's going to say on Friday on our weekend edition. And Chelsea will be with us as well. So we have lots to cover and lots of issues that are on the table, which quite frankly are illustrated by the fact that some of the articles I've posted on the website today, we never even got to. Maybe we'll have a little more time tomorrow, but I don't know. We'll see what happens with these articles of impeachment. So you hope that you will take some time to find out about some of the books we've talked about. We've talked about some of the resources from Martin Mawyer, also Mary DeMuth, and, of course, this book that we've talked about, which is really a Bible, 1-Year Pray for America Bible. You can go and find all of those articles on the website, pointofview.net. Most importantly, I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes and for Steve as well. Visit the website, pointofview.net. Right click on the button that says donate and help us out before the end of the year. And we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.